I think the biggest story fantasy-wise of the first half was the guy you mentioned at the very top of the show, Pete Crow Armstrong. And believe it or not, I have been ruminating over this quite a bit. Like, what what did I miss on Pete Crow Armstrong? I mean, in retrospect, now that there's a full amount of data here, I mean, I can look at why he's succeeding, the very high pull air rate. And I think that's a big story of this season too, is just the introduction of that stat to a player's baseball savant page and how it fills in so many of the gaps with that existed in expected stats previously. And how do you explain why a player underperformed his expected stats or overperformed? Well, a lot of times it just comes down to pull air rate. But that's kind of a tangent. Pete Crow Armstrong, I had him as a bust. All three of us had him as a bust. He's been such a topic of conversation here throughout the first half within kind of the fantasy community that I know most everybody had him as a bust, which meant he was awfully affordable in drafts. Mm-hmm. And I have been struggling the last 5 years or so with how to get an edge, because I feel like the first 10, 12 years, I did have a nice edge in playing fantasy baseball, and it was something I was very confident in my ability, and I felt like I was a dangerous person to go up against in leagues. Like, people were a little scared whenever I was in their league, and that felt good. I want that surge of power back, but there's become such a consensus around players with the introduction of StatCast, and we kind of just analyze players all the same way and come to basically the same conclusions as we did with Pete Crow Armstrong. And so I'm wondering if a market inefficiency exists here that can give me that edge. If there is a guy who had pretty good minor league numbers, had some prospect pedigree, but people are looking at the data points we always look at and decide, probably not that big of a deal. And so he slides in drafts. Maybe that's somebody you should just target for the sake of it, because it's not. If it goes bad, it's the cost isn't high enough that it's really going to sidetrack your season. I'm not saying you do this with a guy, who's a 5th round pick, but Crow Armstrong was sliding into the 12th, 13th round. You don't lose that much by missing on that pick.
Well, so yes, I agree there. Like, if they fall far enough, but the problem is, okay, it works with Pete Crow Armstrong, but what was there to make us believe that something like this was going to happen?
Again, minor league track record.
No, his minor league track record was pretty good.
Yeah,
but he had, between AA and AAA, he had 25 homers in 133 games at 21/22. Not young, or not old, but not so young that you're like, oh, you can just build on those numbers. He's been better than he was in the minors. So that's the thing. I'm sure it's like
AAA. How young do you expect?
He had an 820 OPS in 2 seasons as a 21 and 22-year-old at AAA.
Because he doesn't walk at all. So the OBP is
right, but he's not walking now.
Right, but he's
he's hitting for much more. Right, no, but I'm saying he's hitting he's had 25 homers in 95 games right now. He had 11 in 60 games at AAA. So that I agree that completely fading Pete Crow Armstrong at the price that he was at, clearly a mistake. There was something there. But I don't know if there's a lesson to be learned there. Because he's just gotten so much better.
That's what I'm trying to decide, because I'm not sure I'm totally... Look, Cal Raleigh, I feel fine not predicting him to be the first 50 homer catcher. He had power, but it was 30, 35 homer power.
Mm-hmm.
He was a known quantity at that point, and there was no reason to think he was going to take this big leap. But Pete Crow Armstrong wasn't a known quantity. We just had minor league data. He was a very young guy, not literally a rookie, but basically a rookie.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, okay, let's look at some comps here, historical comps. Mookie Betts. Mookie Betts came up just before the inception of StatCast.
Mm-hmm.
And years before we really knew what to do with StatCast, certainly before I took StatCast seriously. If I saw the data, the same data points for Mookie Betts when he first came up, and I'll say, when Mookie Betts came up, I was a big believer. I was pushing him hard. I certainly wasn't the only one, but I was very much on board with Mookie Betts when he first got called up, and it turned out great. If I had seen those data points for Mookie Betts when he came up, I might have faded him. And I know, like I worked with Al Melchior at the time. He was always into the cutting edge stuff data-wise. Again, StatCast didn't exist there, but he was looking at StatCast type things. Like I know home run distance for Mookie Betts was a sticking point for him. And he was, he's a little more reluctant to embrace Mookie Betts than I was because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, come on!" He's Mookie Betts, like he's crushed it everywhere he's gone, and he's crushing it in the majors so far. And I think you're overthinking this one. And obviously, it played out the way it played out. Mookie Betts has been a generational type of player. But if I knew then what I know that now, would I have been taking the stance more like Al did?
Maybe.
And it would have been a mistake.
Sure. But I would just, my problem with trying to draw a lesson from that is, well, okay, Pete Crow Armstrong worked. Dylan Cruz didn't.
Yeah.
Jason Dominguez hasn't really worked.
Dylan Cruz is still a mystery box.
But it hasn't worked in the same way. If you applied this thought process, Evan Carter, I'm just looking at 2024 top prospects who Kobe Mayo, Heston Kierstad, Mason Wynn, it worked with Pete Crow Armstrong. I don't know if there's
Kobe Mayo has the data points. So these are not all comparable players. I mean, Dylan Cruz has the data points.
Right, but they also have the production and the pedigree. So what's the lesson to be learned from?
So much.
No, but Pete Crow Armstrong didn't. Hold on. But Pete Crow Armstrong didn't have the production at the major league level.
Forget the specific players and the specific data points. The conclusion to draw, and I haven't drawn this conclusion. This is a half-baked idea. But what I'm saying is, if there is a player out there who a certain segment of the baseball analysis community acknowledges is a talent, Pete Crow Armstrong was a legit prospect. But us in our fantasy silo, heavy into the exit velocities and all the StatCast stuff, say, yeah, but is he really? And there's consensus around that because there's always consensus around the StatCast stuff. And so the cost ends up being, the opportunity cost ends up being low for this player, as it was for Pete Crow Armstrong. Is that a market inefficiency that you could take advantage of? Because I need to figure out how to get an edge somehow. And I've struggled to find that place.
Yeah, I think it could be. It just,
that's the one. Work.
That's the one where
the opportunity cost is low.
I think the way to maybe put it would be, as we've talked a lot about, giving the young guys who struggle, and not just in terms of production, but in terms of their StatCast quality. Pete Crow Armstrong's StatCast quality has just gotten better in his second season. It's not like he's the same guy he was last season and is just putting up better numbers. He's playing better,
but that can always happen with a player that young.
Right, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the
biggest takeaway for me is
give grace to the young guys when they struggle.
Is that a young player can improve. Now, I think PCA is kind of 99th percentile outlier. And on top of that, too, I think he's such an extreme example because he's a freak athlete, too, right? I think that there are players that can kind of outperform StatCast data or our expectations of them, or PCA was regarded as a defense first player. Same thing with Francisco Lindor before he got called up, and then Lindor became this awesome offensive player, fantasy player as well. I think that there are certain prospects that are just like such ridiculously good athletes that they can improve so drastically quickly that we didn't even see it coming. That is coming. Other people might have.
That's a heuristic I've tried to apply. This guy's a baseball player, for lack of a better term. Like the guys who are just so good at everything and have such a good sense of how to play baseball. And I think Pete Armstrong is a good example of this. And in a way that a similarly talented player, like maybe Jason Dominguez, is not quite as good of an example of this. And that's not to say he won't get better, but like Jason Dominguez has been a professional for 6 or 7 years, and he's still like weirdly terrible at defense and kind of a mess on the base paths. And like maybe there's something to be drawn there where like Francisco Lindor, just like Mookie Betts, like these dudes just know how to play baseball at like there's not a stat conclusion, just going back to like the old timey, like, you know, he walks the right way and his girlfriend's hot kind of thing that they talk about in Moneyball. Like, you know, maybe you mix in a little bit of that. The one thing I will say is there was one guy I really thought this was going to be true about, and it was Brian Hayes, and it never came together for that guy. So, I mean, injuries played their part, but that was a guy that I was like, he's just a good baseball player, and he's going to figure out the hitting.
But here's the thing. Here's the distinction between Hayes and Crow Armstrong. Crow Armstrong produced in the minors, and Hayes didn't really. And so I feel like interesting that you brought up Moneyball. I feel like there's sort of this horseshoe theory thing developing among baseball, within baseball analysis, and it kind of refers back to the Moneyball time, where, you know, the critique in Moneyball was all the scouts were saying this guy looks like a ball player.
Yeah.
And
can't hit.
And then down here at the base of the horseshoe, you got, but does he produce? And now over here on the other side of the horseshoe, opposite from the scouts, you have this guy's data makes him look like a player. And then you go back to the base of the horseshoe, the middle, and it's like, but does he produce?
Yeah.
And at the end, production is what it's about. And, you know, have we gotten so, just like old scouts used to be so in love with the aesthetics of a player, the data heads now are all caught up in the data, that they're missing the same thing the old scouts were missing, which is, does he produce? And Crow Armstrong had a history of production. So, yeah, it wasn't hitting 40 home runs in the minors. Hardly anybody does.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people listening right now are probably, this is like a revelation for them to hear us kind of talk about baseball and fantasy in this way. I think for a large majority of players, the data that we reference, it's not always perfect, but we reference it for a reason because, okay, we have more data. It makes more sense to use it than to not at this point in time. But yeah, again, I think there are some players that are just going to be outliers, and perhaps Pete Crow Armstrong is just one of those players.
But just to cap it off, it's also worth pointing out, we're not done. Like,
no.
Pete Crow Armstrong could have a 700 OPS the rest of the season, and then we have to have a really interesting conversation next year about what that means.
I hear you, but 25 in the first.
Well, no, but like I'll point to like Gunnar Henderson had 28 and 14 in the first half last year. Then he tailed off and was more like a 780, 790 OPS guy in the second half. And that's kind of what he's been this season. And I know the injury happened and we all expect him to be much better, but it is just to say that like maybe that's happening with Gunnar Henderson, where he's more like, you know, spoiler alert, I have him in the second round, but maybe he's more like a third or fourth round player. And we're just kind of anchoring to his prospect pedigree and the big first half he had last year, but maybe he's more like a low 800s OPS bat. So that's where it's worth remembering in all these discussions that the season's not over.